For the watercolor techniques, I'll be showing you 12 techniques. Half of them will be using mainly dry brush, so using a drier brush on dry paper. And then some of the techniques will be wet on wet, where you have a wet base and you're putting watercolor on that, or you're just working with the watercolor more when it's wet. Those are the two main techniques you can remember when you're thinking about watercolor is, do you need a dry surface, dry brush on dry surface, or are you working with wet on wet? For watercolor, you'll need a few materials. One is your watercolor palette with a cup of water. I have a few watercolor brushes. One is thicker, it's a mop brush, and then one is thinner as well. You'll also need a colored pencil or a crayon, some salt. I have coarser salt, but if you only have table salt, that will work as well. I'm going to be using something sharp to show one of the techniques, so a tack or a paper clip, something sharp would be good. And then masking tape as well. The first technique I'll show is using a round or a flat brush on dry paper. When you start with watercolor, you want to make sure you have a lot of water in your palette where you're mixing your colors. So you always want to keep your paint wet. For my round brush, I'm just going to pick up a color and experiment with showing the different line work using a round brush on dry paper. You can get a lot of detail doing this with a round brush. And I will also show with a flat brush. I'm drying off the brush a little bit, so I just have a little bit of watercolor on it. If you wipe most of your water off, you'll be able to see some nice texture. I would imagine that would be good for anything that has a rougher texture like tree bark. The next technique is graffito. And that is where you scratch into the surface with a sharp object. And then you paint a wash over top. You can see that where I scratched, the watercolor is seeping into that. You don't want to go over it too much, but you can get some nice texture that way ahead of time before you add the watercolor down. Next is stippling. And that is where you take the brush and you are going to go up and down with a drier brush to make stippling marks. The less water you have on your brush, the more textured it will be. And next is a crayon resist. I'm going to take the crayon and draw on my paper. You can also use a colored crayon or colored pencil. I'm going to wash over that. If you have a little bit too much water down, it won't resist quite as much. Let's try that again. There you can see it's resisting a little bit more, but you can see the crayon showing through and then the colored pencil showing through as well. Next is spattering or splatter painting. Whereas where you take the brush and you can flick the bristles to splatter. You can also tap the brush on your hand as well to show splatter marks. The last one is glazing, and I'll need to paint a detail down first and let it dry to put a colored glaze over top. So I'm going to start with this blue. I'm just going to paint some round brush designs. And then I'll come back to that once it's dry. For wet on wet, I'm going to start with a flat wash. And that's where you just use one color and you brush a nice solid coat over everything. For washes, it's good to put a layer of water down first so that it helps the watercolor spread out. So there's a nice flat wash of one color. If you have a little extra paint, you can soak it up with a paper towel as well. Next is the gradient with two colors or more. I'm going to start with my water base and then add two colors. It works well to move one of the colors into the other color. You can see that my green is very overpowering. Your dark color is always going to overpower whatever is lighter. If I want to, I can soak up some of the extra color and add my yellow back in. So there I have a nice fade from yellow to green, and you can do multiple colors if you want to. That would work great for a sunset. Next is a round brush in wet. You can start with a water background with some clean water, a nice clear wash, and instead of waiting for that to dry, I'm going to take my round brush and paint some designs onto the wet background. You can see you don't have as much control here. The watercolor does spread out a lot more. It's a little bit more crazy, so be careful when you're painting watercolor on a wet surface. Next, I'm going to use masking tape. I'm going to lay the masking tape down and then paint over it. You can let the masking tape section dry first before you peel off the tape. I'm going to peel off one right now though, just to see. It probably already kept it pretty crisp. This is a good way to section off portions of your painting. Also, if you want to create a border, it can help with that too. There's a nice crisp edge because I used the masking tape. I've done this one already so far, but you can lift out the color or blot colors using a napkin or a paper towel. And then while that watercolor is still wet, I'm going to take my napkin and I'm going to lift that out. This is a great way to clean up mistakes. If you made a mistake, you can soak up a good amount of the watercolor that way. Last is the salt. That is where you will paint your color down. You'll have to work very quickly. You'll paint your color down first, and then you'll sprinkle salt on top. You can see that as you place the salt down, it starts to absorb the watercolor, so we'll let that dry and go back to the glazing. After you let your first layer dry, you can put any color on top and it will not affect the watercolor below. So you can do this to create a overlaying of color over top of what you already painted. I'm going to glaze a violet, a really light violet over top. So you can see you can cover over sections that you already have layers on top. I'm going to let the salt dry and then we'll check back in to see what it looks like. All right, it looks like the salt section is dry, and so what I'm going to do is just brush off the salt and see what's underneath. You can see how the salt absorbed the watercolor, so there's darker rings around where the salt crystals were, so that's a neat effect. I also tried a little bit more with the sgraffito. I carved a little bit deeper and did a quick wash with a darker color over top, and you can see that it shows the detail a lot better. Another thing to remember is that when you rinse out your brushes, you always want to make sure you squeeze the water out of your brush. And then you want to reshape the brush into the form, and that way it dries and is ready for the next time you need to use it.